My son tried to kill me, and I never saw it coming until my 7-year-old grandson whispered those words that changed everything. Grandpa, don't eat the medicine. Dad's trying to kill you. I heard him say it himself to my mom. The pills in my weathered palms suddenly felt like poison, and the man I'd raised, the boy I'd taught to throw a baseball and drive a stick shift, became a stranger in that single, devastating moment. I'm 83 years old, and I thought I knew everything there was to know about betrayal. I'd lived through a war, buried my wife of 57 years, survived the slow erosion of my body as arthritis claimed my joints and diabetes threatened my vision. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the crushing weight of realizing that my own flesh and blood had been slowly poisoning me for months, waiting patiently for my death so he could inherit everything I'd worked my entire life to build. The irony wasn't lost on me, even in that moment of horror. I'd been what people today might call a traditional man, though back in my day we just called it being a man. I believed sons carried on the family name, sons inherited the land, sons were the ones you groomed to take over when you were gone. My daughter Sarah had always been the one who called every Sunday, who remembered my birthday, who drove 3 hours just to check on me after Helen died. But when it came time to write my will 15 years ago, I'd left everything to Michael. The house, the farm, the savings account, even Helen's jewelry. Because that's what fathers did. That's what my father had done, and his father before him. Sarah never complained, never even asked why. She just kept showing up, kept caring, kept being the child who actually acted like they loved me. And Michael? He visited twice a year, Christmas and my birthday, always with his wife Linda hovering behind him like a vulture, both of them asking careful questions about my health, my medications, my plans for the future. I thought they cared. God help me, I thought they were worried about their old man. The morning little Tommy saved my life started like any other. I was sitting in my recliner, the one Helen had bought me for my 70th birthday, watching the news and waiting for my morning pills. My routine had become sacred over the past 2 years since the doctors added more medications to keep my heart steady and my blood pressure down. 7 pills every morning, 4 at lunch, 3 at bedtime. A rainbow of pharmaceutical promises that kept this old body shuffling along day after day. Tommy had spent the night, which wasn't unusual. Michael and Linda had been dropping him off more frequently lately, always with some excuse about date nights or work obligations. I didn't mind. The boy was good company, and the house felt less empty when his laughter echoed through rooms that had grown too quiet since Helen passed. He was sitting on the floor playing with his toy cars when I shook out my morning pills into my palm. That's when he looked up at me with those serious brown eyes that reminded me so much of Michael at that age, before life and greed had twisted something pure into something ugly. "Grandpa," he said quietly, glancing toward the kitchen where his father was making coffee, "don't eat the medicine." I almost laughed. Kids say the strangest things. Why not, buddy? Grandpa needs his medicine to stay healthy. But Tommy's face didn't change. He crawled closer to my chair and lowered his voice to barely a whisper. "Dad's trying to kill you." I heard him say it himself to my mom. The pills scattered across my lap as my hands started shaking. 7 years old. This child was 7 years old, and he was trying to warn me that his father, my son, was plotting my murder. The rational part of my brain wanted to dismiss it as childhood imagination, maybe something he'd seen on television. But the look in his eyes, the genuine fear and concern, made my stomach drop like I'd swallowed ice. "When did you hear this, Tommy?" I managed to ask, my voice barely steady. "Last night. After you went to bed." They were talking in the kitchen, and Mom said the pills weren't working fast enough. Dad said they had to be patient, that if they gave you too much at once, people would get suspicious. Tommy's voice was matter of fact, the way children relay information they don't fully understand. "Dad said once you're gone, we can finally live the way we're supposed to." I felt something inside my chest crack, not physically, but something deeper. The foundation of everything I'd believed about family, about blood, about the man I'd raised. My son, my boy, the child I'd taught to be strong and self-reliant, was systematically poisoning his own father. Michael walked into the living room carrying his coffee mug, the same mug I'd given him years ago that said, "World's Greatest Dad." He smiled at me, that same easy smile he'd had since childhood, and for a moment I wondered if Tommy had imagined the whole thing. "Morning, Dad. You take your pills yet?" The question that had been routine for months suddenly sounded different. Loaded. Expectant. I looked down at the scattered pills in my lap, then at Tommy, who was watching me with wide, worried eyes. "Just about to," I said, gathering the pills back into my palm. Tommy was telling me about a dream he had. Michael's expression didn't change, but I caught something in his eyes, a flicker of concern that had nothing to do with fatherly worry. Kids have wild imaginations, don't they? "Tommy, why don't you go play in the kitchen while Grandpa takes his medicine?" The boy looked between us, and I could see him weighing whether to obey his father or continue protecting me. The fact that a 7-year-old felt he needed to protect me from his own father made something hot and angry rise in my throat. "Actually," I said, standing up slowly, "I think I'll take them with breakfast today. Might help with the stomach upset I've been having." It was a lie. I hadn't been having stomach problems. But I needed time to think, and I needed these pills analyzed. 40 years of running my own business had taught me to trust my instincts, and every instinct I had was screaming that my grandson had just saved my life. Michael's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "You should really stick to your routine, Dad. The doctor said consistency is important." "The doctors say a lot of things," I replied, walking toward my bedroom. "I'll be fine." I locked the bedroom door behind me, something I hadn't done in years. My hands were shaking as I dumped the pills into a small plastic bag and hid them in the back of my dresser drawer. Then I sat on the edge of the bed Helen and I had shared for over 50 years and tried to process what was happening. My son was trying to kill me. Not in a moment of passion, not in a fit of rage, but slowly, methodically, with the patience of someone who had planned this carefully. The extra visits, the sudden concern about my medication routine, Linda's questions about my will, the way they'd both started treating me like I was already fading away. It had all been performance, elaborate theater designed to position themselves for my death while making sure no one would suspect foul play. The worst part was realizing how long it had probably been going on. The increasing fatigue I'd attributed to age, the dizzy spells that came more frequently, the way my heart seemed to skip beats more often. I'd been dying slowly, and I'd been thanking them for their concern while they were orchestrating my murder. I thought about Helen, about how she'd always worried about Michael's selfishness. "He takes after your father," she used to say, not meaning it as a compliment. My own father had been a hard man who believed the world owed him something, and Helen had seen those same seeds in our son. But she'd always held out hope that love and guidance would nurture the better parts of him. She'd been wrong. We'd both been wrong. A soft knock on the door interrupted my thoughts. "Grandpa?" Tommy's voice was small, uncertain. I opened the door and found him standing there alone, his toy car clutched in his small fist. Behind him, I could hear Michael and Linda talking in low voices in the kitchen. "Are you okay?" he asked, looking up at me with those two serious eyes. I knelt down to his level, my old knees protesting. "Tommy, I need you to listen to me very carefully. You were very brave to tell me what you heard, and you might have saved Grandpa's life. But I need you to promise me something." He nodded solemnly. "Don't tell your mom and dad that you warned me, okay? This is going to be our secret for now. Can you do that? Are they really trying to hurt you?" The innocence in his voice nearly broke my heart. No child should have to worry about whether their parents are capable of murder. No grandfather should have to explain that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones who hurt you the deepest. I'm going to make sure I'm safe, I told him. But I need you to be very careful too. If you ever hear them talking about hurting anyone, you tell me right away, okay? He nodded again, then surprised me by throwing his arms around my neck. I love you, Grandpa. I love you too, buddy. More than you'll ever know. After they left that afternoon, I sat in my empty house and made the hardest phone call of my life. Sarah. It's Dad. I need you to come over. Tonight if you can. And don't tell Michael you're coming. My daughter arrived 2 hours later, her face creased with worry. Sarah had always been the spitting image of her mother, all soft curves and gentle strength, but with steel in her spine when it mattered. At 54, she was a nurse, a mother of 3, and the kind of person who would drop everything to help someone in need. Dad, what's wrong? You sounded terrible on the phone. I told her everything. About Tommy's warning, about the pills I'd hidden, about the months of increasing symptoms I'd attributed to old age. I watched her face change as the reality sank in, watched the disbelief give way to horror, then to a fierce protectiveness that reminded me so much of Helen. We need to call the police, she said immediately. With what proof? The word of a 7-year-old against his own father. They'll think we're crazy, or that I'm suffering from dementia. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing. Then she stood up and paced across the living room, her nursing training kicking in. We get the pills tested first. Establish that they've been tampered with. Then we build a case. And in the meantime, you're coming home with me tonight. Right now. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow. I looked around the house I'd lived in for 38 years, the house I'd brought Helen to as a newlywed, where we'd raised our children and planned our future. The thought of leaving it, even temporarily, felt like admitting defeat. Dad, Sarah said softly, following my gaze, the house isn't worth your life. She was right. I packed a bag with shaking hands, taking only the essentials and the hidden pills. As we drove through the darkness toward Sarah's house an hour away, I kept thinking about Michael as a little boy, how he'd run to greet me when I came home from work, how proud I'd been when he'd graduated college, when he'd gotten married, when Tommy was born. When had that love turned to greed? When had I become more valuable to him dead than alive? Sarah's husband Jim welcomed me without question, setting up the guest room and making me feel like family instead of an inconvenience. Their kids, my other grandchildren, seemed genuinely happy to have me there. It was a stark contrast to the performance I'd been getting from Michael and Linda. The next morning, Sarah drove the pills to a private lab. The results came back 3 days later. My heart medication had been replaced with something that would cause cardiac episodes, and my blood pressure pills had been switched with a drug that would interact dangerously with my diabetes medication. Separately, either substitution might cause concerning symptoms. Together, they were a death sentence disguised as natural causes. It's sophisticated, the lab technician explained. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. The dosages were carefully calculated to cause gradual organ failure that would look like age-related decline. I felt sick. My own son had researched how to kill me. He'd probably spent hours online, learning about drug interactions and lethal combinations. The level of premeditation was staggering. That afternoon, my phone started ringing. Michael, wondering where I was, why I wasn't answering at home. I let it go to voicemail. Dad, it's Michael. Just checking on you. I brought your dinner over, but you're not here. Call me back when you get this. The concern in his voice sounded so genuine that for a moment I questioned everything. But then I remembered Tommy's frightened whisper, remembered the lab results, and I knew there was no going back. The second call came an hour later, then a third. By evening, both Michael and Linda were leaving increasingly frantic messages. They needed to know where I was, needed to make sure I was taking my medications, needed to help me if I was confused or lost. Sarah listened to the messages with growing anger. They're panicking because their plan is falling apart. They probably figured out that you didn't take the pills yesterday morning. On the second night, Michael showed up at Sarah's house. I heard the doorbell ring, heard Sarah answer it, heard my son's voice raised in what he probably thought was justified concern. "Where is he, Sarah? Dad's missing. He's not at home, he's not answering his phone. I'm worried about him." "He's safe," Sarah replied calmly. "What do you mean, safe? Safe from what? I'm his son. If something's wrong, I have a right to know." I walked to the top of the stairs and looked down at my son standing in Sarah's foyer. Even from that distance, I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. This wasn't the behavior of a worried child. This was the behavior of someone whose carefully laid plans were unraveling. "Hello, Michael," I said quietly. He looked up at me with what might have passed for relief if I hadn't known better. "Dad. Thank God. I've been worried sick. Why didn't you call me? Are you okay? Have you been taking your medications? Always back to the medications." I came down the stairs slowly, feeling every one of my 83 years. When I reached the bottom, I stood facing the son I'd raised, the man I'd taught to hunt and fish and work with his hands, the boy who used to crawl into bed with Helen and me during thunderstorms. "I'm fine, Michael. Better than I've been in months, actually." Something flickered across his face. "But your medications are interesting," I finished. "Very interesting, in fact." The silence stretched between us. Sarah stood slightly behind him, ready to intervene if needed. Through the window, I could see Linda sitting in their car, watching the house. "I don't understand," Michael said, but his voice had lost some of its conviction. "I think you understand perfectly." I pulled the lab report from my pocket and handed it to him. "Care to explain how my heart medication got replaced with something that could kill me?" I watched my son's face as he read the report. Watched the color drain from his cheeks, watched his mouth open and close without sound. For a moment, he looked like the child he'd once been, caught in a lie and trying to figure out how to escape the consequences. Then something harder settled over his features. "This is ridiculous. You can't possibly think I would." "Tommy heard you," I said simply. "My grandson, your son, heard you and Linda planning my murder. A 7-year-old child had to save my life from his own father." The denial died on his lips. He stood there holding the lab report, and I could see him calculating, trying to figure out his next move. It occurred to me that this was probably the first time in his adult life that he'd been caught in something he couldn't charm or lie his way out of. "Dad," he said finally, his voice dropping to a whisper, "you don't understand the pressure we're under. The bills, the mortgage, Linda's medical expenses. So you decided to kill me for my money? It wasn't supposed to be like this." The words exploded out of him. "You're 83 years old. You've had a good life. We thought it would be easier for everyone if it happened naturally. By poisoning me. By helping you along. You've been suffering since Mom died. You're lonely, you're in pain. I was in pain because you were murdering me." Sarah stepped forward. "Michael, you need to leave. Now." But he wasn't done. Maybe it was desperation, maybe it was the relief of finally admitting what he'd done, but the words kept pouring out of him. "Do you have any idea what it's been like, waiting? Watching you get older and weaker and knowing that everything we need to fix our lives is just sitting there in your accounts, in this house. We can't afford Tommy's school, can't afford to fix Linda's teeth, can't afford anything while you sit on hundreds of thousands of dollars that you're never going to spend. The greed in his voice was breathtaking. Not remorse, not shame, just anger that his plan hadn't worked. So you thought you'd speed things along, I said. How long have you been poisoning me, Michael? He didn't answer, but he didn't need to. I could see it in his eyes. Months. Maybe longer. Get out, Sarah said, her voice deadly quiet. Get out of my house before I call the police. You can't prove anything, Michael said, some of his confidence returning. That lab report could be wrong. Pills get contaminated all the time. And even if they didn't, you can't prove I had anything to do with it. He was right, and we all knew it. The pills had been in my possession, in my house where he had access. Any decent lawyer would tear apart our case in minutes. But I had one advantage he didn't know about yet. You're right, I said. I can't prove you tried to kill me. But I can control what happens to my money. For the first time, real fear flickered across his face. What do you mean? I mean I'm changing my will. You can't do that. I can, and I will. Tomorrow morning, in fact. Sarah, would you mind driving me to Harold Goldman's office? Sarah smiled grimly. I'd be happy to. Michael's face went white. Dad, you can't be serious. I made a mistake, okay? I was desperate. But you can't cut me out completely. I'm your son. Yes, I said sadly. You are. And that makes this the worst betrayal of all. He left that night, but not before making threats that sounded more like promises. He'd contest the will, he'd prove I was mentally incompetent, he'd make sure Sarah never saw a penny of my money. It was ugly and desperate, and it broke something in me that I don't think will ever fully heal. The next morning, Sarah drove me to Harold Goldman's office. Harold had been my lawyer for 20 years, had handled Helen's funeral arrangements and helped me set up the trust for the grandchildren's education. He was a good man, someone I trusted completely. Harold, I said, settling into the chair across from his desk, I need to change my will. Everything. Complete overhaul. I told him what had happened, showed him the lab report, explained why I needed to act quickly. Harold listened without interruption, his expression growing more grave with each detail. Jesus, Robert, he said when I finished. I'm so sorry. This is. I can't imagine what you're going through. I need to make sure Michael can't contest this. I need it ironclad. Harold nodded. We'll document everything. The lab report, witness statements, medical records showing your symptoms improved after you stopped taking the tampered medications. We'll include a detailed explanation of your mental competency and your reasons for the changes. It took most of the day, but when we were finished, my will looked completely different. Sarah would inherit the house, the farm, and the majority of my savings. The grandchildren's college funds were protected in trust. Michael would get a token inheritance of $1,000 and a letter explaining exactly why. I want him to know, I told Harold. I want him to understand that this isn't senility or spite. This is the consequence of trying to murder his own father. That evening, Sarah and I sat on her back porch watching her youngest daughter practice soccer in the yard. The normalcy of it, the simple pleasure of watching a child play, felt like a gift after everything that had happened. Do you think you'll ever forgive him? Sarah asked quietly. I'd been asking myself the same question. I don't know. Part of me wants to believe that the Michael I raised is still in there somewhere, that desperation just made him temporarily crazy. But Sarah, the calculation involved in what he did, that's not temporary insanity. That's who he is. I know, she said. I've known for years that Michael was selfish, but I never thought he was capable of murder. Neither did I. We sat in silence for a while, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Helen had always loved sunsets. She used to say they reminded her that even endings could be beautiful. My phone rang. Michael, of course. I'd been ignoring his calls all day, but something made me answer this one. Dad. His voice was raw, desperate. Please. We need to talk. I think we've said everything we need to say. Linda's pregnant. The words hit me like a physical blow. Another grandchild, another innocent life that would be affected by all of this. Congratulations, I managed. We need the money, Dad. For the baby, for Tommy's future. You can't just abandon your family because of a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding. He was calling attempted murder a misunderstanding. The baby will be provided for, I said. I'm setting up a trust fund that will cover education and medical expenses. But you, Michael, you won't see a penny of my money. Dad, please. I hung up and turned off the phone. Sarah reached over and squeezed my hand. You did the right thing, she said. I hoped she was right. The harassment started the next day. Phone calls at all hours, Michael showing up at Sarah's work, Linda crying on social media about how I'd abandoned my family in their time of need. They painted me as a cruel old man who'd chosen favorites, who'd let my daughter turn me against my son. The hardest part was Tommy. Michael and Linda stopped bringing him around, effectively cutting off my relationship with my grandson as punishment for protecting myself from their murder plot. I missed him terribly, worried about what they were telling him, what kind of poison they were filling his young mind with. But I held firm. Harold assured me the will was bulletproof, and the evidence of the tampered medications was documented with multiple witnesses. Michael could contest all he wanted, but he wasn't going to win. 3 months later, the calls stopped. Sarah heard through mutual friends that Michael and Linda had moved to another state, supposedly for a job opportunity. I suspected they'd realized their legal challenges weren't going anywhere and decided to start fresh somewhere else. The relief was overwhelming. For the first time since Tommy's warning, I could sleep through the night without worrying about my son breaking into Sarah's house to finish what he'd started. But the victory felt hollow. I'd won, but what had I won? The right to die naturally instead of being murdered by my own child. The satisfaction of ensuring my would-be killer wouldn't profit from my death. These felt like the smallest possible victories, the barest minimum of what a father should be able to expect from his son. I moved back into my own house 6 months later. Sarah wasn't happy about it, but she understood my need to reclaim the space that had been violated by Michael's betrayal. I changed the locks, installed a security system, and made sure my medications were stored in a locked box that only I had access to. The house felt different, though. Every room held memories not just of the good times, but of the months when my son had been slowly poisoning me. I found myself avoiding the kitchen where he'd stood asking about my morning pills. I couldn't sit in my recliner without remembering the moment Tommy had warned me about the medicine. But slowly, carefully, I began to rebuild my sense of safety. I established new routines, made new friends through Sarah's church, even started dating a widow named Margaret who made me laugh and reminded me that there was still joy to be found in life. The legal proceedings dragged on for 2 years. Michael hired a lawyer who challenged everything, my mental competency, the validity of the lab results, even the authenticity of my signature on the new will. But Harold had done his job well, and every challenge was defeated. The final court date was on a Tuesday in October. Michael flew back for the hearing, looking older and harder than I remembered. He sat across the courtroom from me, and when our eyes met, I saw no remorse, no regret, just cold anger that his plan had failed. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. The will stood as written. Michael's challenge was dismissed with prejudice, meaning he couldn't try again. As the court emptied, he approached me one last time. "I hope you're happy," he said quietly. "You've destroyed your own family over a misunderstanding." Still calling it a misunderstanding. After everything we'd been through, all the evidence, all the testimony, he still couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge what he tried to do. "No, Michael," I said. "You destroyed this family the moment you decided I was worth more to you dead than alive." He walked away without another word, and I knew I'd never see him again. It should have felt like closure, but it just felt empty. Tommy called me on my 86th birthday. He was 10 by then, old enough to understand more about what had happened, old enough to find my number and dial it himself. "Grandpa." His voice was different, deeper, but still carrying that same sweetness that had made him my favorite person in the world. "Tommy." "Oh, buddy, I've missed you so much." "I missed you too. Dad said I wasn't supposed to call you, but I wanted to wish you happy birthday." We talked for 20 minutes. He told me about school, about his friends, about the new baby sister who was walking now. I told him about Margaret, about the garden I'd started, about how proud I was that he'd been brave enough to save my life. "Grandpa," he said as we were saying goodbye. "Are you still mad at Dad?" The question broke my heart. How do you explain to a child that their father tried to commit murder? How do you help them understand that sometimes the people who should love us the most are capable of the deepest betrayals? "I'm not mad, Tommy. I'm sad. But I want you to know that none of this is your fault, and I will always, always love you." "I love you too, Grandpa." After we hung up, I sat in my living room and cried for the first time since Helen died. Not just for what I'd lost, but for what Tommy had lost too. A grandfather who lived nearby, family gatherings, the security of knowing that his father was a good man. Michael's greed had stolen that from his son just as surely as it had tried to steal my life from me. I never heard from Michael again. Sometimes I wonder if he ever told Linda the real reason I changed my will, or if she still believes I was just a vindictive old man. Sometimes I wonder if he's capable of feeling guilt for what he did, or if he's convinced himself that he was the victim in all of this. Mostly, though, I try not to think about him at all. Sarah inherited everything when I died 5 years later, peacefully in my sleep at the age of 88. I'd lived to see her children graduate college, to walk Margaret down the aisle when we married 2 years after the trial, to know that the money I'd worked my whole life to accumulate would go to someone who actually deserved it. But that's not really the end of the story, because the real ending happened long before my death. It happened the morning a 7-year-old boy saved my life with 6 words, "Dad's trying to kill you, Grandpa." The real ending was realizing that family isn't just about blood. It's about who shows up, who cares, who protects the people they love instead of exploiting them. Sarah had been my real heir all along, not because she was perfect, but because she understood that love is something you demonstrate through actions, not just words. Tommy grew up to be a fine young man, a doctor like his Aunt Sarah, someone who dedicated his life to healing instead of hurting. He named his firstborn son after me, and when he brought little Robert to visit my grave, he told him the story of how his great-great-grandfather had once been saved by the courage of a child who chose to speak up when he saw something wrong. That, I think, is the legacy I'm proudest of. Not the money or the property, but the lesson that even when the people who should protect you become the people you need protection from, there's always a choice to be made. You can choose courage over comfort, truth over convenience, love over greed. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, a small voice will whisper a warning that saves your life and reminds you that goodness still exists in the world, even in the darkest of betrayals.